Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Let's get into it. In the autumn of 1918, Germany was a defeated nation. Its army was in full retreat, a fighting retreat, but still a retreat that they couldn't stop. In November, Germany's leaders decided to meet with the Allies in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. There, they decided to agree to an armistice. This ceasefire would begin at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of November of 1918. Although this is often seen as the end of World War I, legally speaking, it wasn't. This was a ceasefire. For the time being, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war would remain languishing within their camps. The government had to formally end the war against the Allies, and as a defeated nation, they wouldn't have a lot of say in how they were treated. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was the meeting to decide how World War I would formally be ended. Although the fighting had stopped on November 11th, 1918, it took 6 months of planning and negotiations before the treaty ending the war was signed. The victorious Allied leaders all wanted to punish Germany, to a greater or lesser extent, and set about putting together a treaty to do this. Germany was not invited. Germany was not militarily able to resist anyway. We're now going to consider the Allied motives. First up, we have Georges Clemenceau of France. He wanted to punish Germany, so wanted Germany to accept blame for the war. He wanted Germany to pay for the damage caused in the war, particularly the damage caused to France. He wanted Germany's armed forces weakened so that they could never attack again. And he wanted Germany to give up land, partly to make France more secure, partly to make them more powerful, and partly to humiliate the Germans. Then we've got David Lloyd George of Great Britain. Lloyd George knew that the public wanted Germany to be punished and to take blame for the war. However, he also wanted to guarantee the security of the British Empire. Perhaps more secretly, he wanted to eventually be able to restart trade with Germany. The British economy had been wrecked in World War I. Pre-war, Germany had been an incredibly important trading partner, and Lloyd George knew that rebuilding this was key to Britain's recovery as well. And then finally, we have Woodrow Wilson of the USA. He wanted to avoid US involvement in future wars, and he wanted to establish a League of Nations to discuss disputes and prevent wars. He was not so much in the business of wanting to punish Germany, but perhaps that's understandable. The Americans had lost far fewer men in the First World War, and of course America was very far away from their destruction. We're now going to have a look at what the main terms of the treaty were. A handy way of remembering this is LAM. Here's why LAM is such a good way to remember the main terms. LAM stands for land. This is the effects on German territory. Army, the effects on the German armed forces. Money, effects on the German economy. And blame, Germany accepting responsibility for starting the war. So LAM is land, army, money and blame. But let's consider, why would Germans have hated specific examples of this treaty? And was it fair? Well, we're going to take each of the main terms one at a time and see what the effects were, starting with land. This map helps us to understand some of the land effects on Germany. Belgium gained land from Germany at the end of the war. You can see this in yellow on the map here. But also Germany lost all of its pre-war empire. Denmark also gained land from Germany, although this was to be decided in a plebiscite or vote after the war. Germany lost land to Poland too, splitting the country in two. The city of Danzig became international. This so-called Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany and was tremendously unpopular. Germany had to give the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia. This would later become one of the things that Hitler was determined to recapture. Germany was not allowed to unite with Austria, so as to weaken future alliances. And France got back the land that had been captured by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Germany had to give coal and steel to the French as part of reparations. More on those later on. And Germany overall had shrunk in size by 13%. However, don't ignore the orange area to the west of the country, which is labelled the Rhineland. This was to be a demilitarised zone. This part of Germany was not allowed to have any soldiers based upon it. That was supposed to reassure the Belgians and the French that Germany would not be able to invade them again. Now let's consider the terms relating to the army. The German Navy was limited to 6 battleships, 6 cruisers and 6 destroyers. They were not allowed any submarines. Germany was forbidden from having an air force. Curiously, the Allies demanded that the feared Fokker D-7 fighter planes, like the one pictured, were handed over, possibly because they wanted to copy its design. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men. That might sound like a lot, but it had numbered in the millions before, and armies of the time tended to be much bigger than that. This was barely enough to even police riots in Germany. Also, no troops were allowed to enter the Rhineland as previously mentioned. And lastly, Germany was banned from having tanks in its army. Not that they used very many of them in World War I anyway. Before we look at our next main term, let's consider why the Allies were so angry with Germany in the first place. This pre-war postcard of the Belgian city of Ypres shows 2 of its main medieval landmarks. To the left we have the beautiful cathedral, and to the right the impressive cloth hall, itself looking like a cathedral but an ancient covered market for the cloth trade. These were 2 of the most important surviving medieval buildings in Europe. And this is how they looked in 1918, after 4 years of war. Frankly, the Allies blamed the Germans for all of this, and they wanted their cities rebuilt, brick by brick, exactly as they had been or better, and they wanted Germany to pay. This brings us on to our third term, money. World War I had caused more destruction and loss of life than any previous war in history. French and Belgian cities, such as Ypres, had been completely levelled. The Germans were forced to pay for the repairs through compensation known as reparations. Consider that word reparations. It almost contains the word repair, and that gives you a hint as to how the money was supposed to be used. The cost of this was £6.6 billion, and that's in the money of the time, not in today's money. A truly colossal amount. This cost financially ruined Germany. At one point in 1923 to 24, Germany was printing money, causing hyperinflation, where German money lost all of its value. But we'll have a future video to look at that in detail. Having to pay reparations was one of the most unpopular things about an already unpopular treaty in Germany. The final point to consider is blame. In order to force the Germans to accept the other restrictions, the Allies forced them to accept total blame for starting the war. This was known as Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called war guilt clause. This was hated by the German people, who felt it was untrue and unfair. After all, perhaps there is some truth in saying that lots of countries had a role in starting World War I. The German Kaiser or king had abdicated. This meant that many people felt that their newly elected government had stabbed the German army in the back by surrendering and accepting blame. This brought about a very dangerous legend. The Dolchschloss theory wasn't true, and it translates as stab in the back. But it was later used by the Nazis to make people hate communists and Jews, who they blamed for losing the war. Again, this wasn't true, but the key thing was that enough people believed it. Let's recap the main points. Remember LAM. Land. Germany lost 13% of its land and 100% of its empire. The Rhineland was demilitarised and France took control of coalfields. Germans hated giving up parts of their country to former enemies. This was a humiliation for them. Army. Germany was allowed no air force, no submarines, only a small navy. The army was limited to 100,000 men and was allowed no tanks. Germans hated this because they felt weak and defenceless, and in fact they were. Money. Germany had to pay £6.6 billion in reparations to fix war damage. Germans hated this as their economy was already ruined by the war, and this made matters worse. And finally, blame. Germany had to accept total blame for the war. Article 231, the so-called war guilt clause, ensured this, and in fact enabled all of those other things to be passed. After all, how could Germany complain when they admitted to starting the war? The Germans hated this as they felt that it was unfair. They considered their government November criminals for agreeing to sign it and for ending the war. So the Treaty of Versailles did punish Germany. Historians are undecided as to how fair this punishment was. But what we can be sure of is many Germans, and in fact most Germans, really hated it. And this would cause problems for Germany and the world down the road. But for now, that's the end of this rapid revision video. Thanks very much for watching. And for now, I'll say goodbye. But just before I do, if you did enjoy this video and it was useful to you, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps spread the word out there. But for now, again, thank you and goodbye.